Welcome to the Post-Capitalist Workplace podcast, hosted by Anuradha, a leading accessibility strategist supporting organizations of today to become organizations of the future. In Season 1, we'll explore what accessibility truly means at its core, as well as the crucial role it plays in decolonizing organizations. While Season 2 spotlights real-world examples of impactful accessibility initiatives and why they're key to addressing some of society's biggest challenges. Hi, welcome everybody. Welcome back to Episode 4. As you know, in Episode 3, I started talking about it's not really so bad, is it? And talking about the real barriers individuals and groups of people face as they're trying to even enter the workforce, and the inequality and inequity that makes it very difficult for them to find employment, maintain employment, and some of the capitalistic structures that impact them. I'm going to continue that today, but as I was putting together this episode, and shout out to Craig Burgess of One Stop Podcast, because he's been producing these podcasts and he's doing a fantastic job. But I wanted to share some of the things that were also on my mind. First, I am kind of beating myself up a little in my head saying, oh, I didn't cover this protected group and that marginalization or this accessibility point. There are so many. There are too many for me to mention here. There is plenty of research and lived experience for us to tap into here. But I do want to at least acknowledge a couple that I wish I had more time for, and I probably will address in future episodes, which would be talking a little bit more about protected characteristics, especially for UK-based businesses. The same thing around people seeking asylum. I think this is going to be one of the things that we need to address in a big way. And that also looks at how we use borders and citizenship and so on in employment. One of the things that we might see here is their credentials not transferring, language access, different systems or jargon or terminology, that this group of people is going to only grow as climate change grows. Another thing is technology and AI and other things. Right now, we've seen in terms of people at grocery stores, for instance, actually liking the human touch and bringing that back. Or we're seeing some companies roll out even more AI for their chat feature or so on. So how does that impact people's jobs and the way we use technology? And that can be more inclusive in some cases, but also create additional barriers or keep jobs out of the market, right? Like that we, instead of hiring a person, we use this technology instead. This forced back to work situation, I think I mentioned that before, but how we use our workplaces and how we connect as a community in our workplace is a big deal. And then thinking about intersectionality, that different people from different groups might have more than one access need, more than one barrier. Even if we look at something like blindness, there are so many ways that eyesight loss or vision impairment can happen. So the access needs can be wildly different if it's color blindness versus peripheral sight loss or so on. So the needs are actually very different. And so even if we support one protected class or one group within this, a disabled group for visual impairment, there's still so many access needs that we need to be thinking about. So those are the big things. But the thing I want you to take away, if you take away nothing else from this episode, is I think of this like a lasagna. And let me explain what I mean by that. That we know these systemic structures like capitalism, ableism, and racism, for instance, they all are working on very specific things. Actually, capitalism, cis-hetero patriarchy, and colonialism all work hand in hand to create very specific dynamics in the world. And they are a lasagna. If we think about it, the initial layer will be the internalized layer. So we might internalize misogyny or racism because we are in that group and we absorb the cultural conditioning that is coming from the messaging from around us, and we might absorb that. There's also the interpersonal level, and the interpersonal level of this lasagna might be biases against each other. So hiring person having a bias against someone's name or some of the other things we've talked about in this episode. So that could be a thing. And that it might be a slur, and that's the way most people think racism occurs. And that's it. If I just don't have those biases or don't talk about those biases or don't use certain types of words, we're okay. But it's actually the next two layers of the lasagna that are more concerning. And that is the institutionalized and systemic layers of the lasagna. Institutionalized layers of the lasagna might look more like rules of the culture or rules in the organization or sector or industry that we're working in. And those things become very embedded in the way we institutionalize things. That's from those places, the institutions like textbooks for education come into play. And those are a big piece here. Then we have the systemic layers, and that's where it becomes a global or a systemic wide cultural phenomenon. This is where we have laws that uphold these barriers. And I'm going to explain each of these in a moment, but these are the way these four pieces of the lasagna work together to keep people out of employment or so on. And let me give you a few examples. If we think about the ableism is this system where we tie people's worth to their bottom line, to how much they're able to produce. Under capitalism, how much you produce, and not the kind of invisible labor we might do at home of caretaking or doing the dishes at home. No, this is the outward labor in the public sphere. That is valued, and not all of that is valued, depending on who's doing it, right? So if we're thinking on an individual level, this might show up as not allowing ourselves to take a nap. And somebody that I follow from the nap ministry really talks about the point of rest is not so then we can rest to be more productive again, but the rest is in its own right for us to rest, and that the radical nature of that. So then at the internalized level, my type of job, how much I'm making, all of this not allowing myself to rest, measuring my worth by how much I do produce. These are the kinds of things that we might have going on, even though it might not be so conscious, but that might be what's happening, right? I'm going to overwork. And especially if we're thinking of disabled people, they might have pushed themselves well beyond their capacity on any given day. Then we go into the interpersonal. And that might be, I remember this from my 20s, and I grew up in a US context for everyone, that people would kind of compare how much sleep they were getting. And it almost seemed like the thing is, can I survive on less and less sleep? And that's the kind of way the conversation went, and I think that is changing to a degree, but that might be the way we start interpersonally dealing with it. Having competitions on how little sleep we're doing, how many, looking at each other's, judging each other based on how much worth they are giving to the world. Like we ask what people do in the world. And then from that, we decide, that is a good use of time and that is worth a lot and worthy of respect or not. And we're silently judging. Maybe you as an individual aren't doing this, but as a society, we are definitely doing this. Certain people deserve more time and respect and attention and are of, their wages are justified and other people are not. But once again, these are minimal. We can work on these as individuals or within interpersonality, but I think the more juice for our work is looking at the systemic and institutionalized level. So when we think about the institutionalized and systemic levels, we rarely see disabled people represented in the workplace. For instance, going back to some of the visually impaired and blind statistics, only 1 in 4 people is blind in the workplace. And that's not because they're not capable. That is because they're not being hired. So about 24% of the workplace is blind or visually impaired. And I think this is registered. This is a UK statistic. So these are registered blind and visually impaired people. But when we think about it, how many people using glasses? That's a type of visual impairment as well. So we don't see that representation. How are they portrayed in movies? How are they portrayed in the media and the news cycle? They're called scroungers. So those are the ways systemically we are talking about them, that they are taking so much money from the system without giving back. And there's a few problems with that mentality. One, the amount that we're giving disabled people is so little, and the amount of people abusing that are so little, but the amount we're giving in public welfare to corporations is massive. They don't pay taxes. They don't pay wealth taxes, and they are the ones getting a significant portion and actually going to lawmakers to push for laws in their favor most of the time. And they're the ones not paying a living wage. They're the ones doing a lot of the damage, and then they're taking more. So it's the way we're framing all of this that is systemic or systematic, and institutionalized levels of ableism start to look like. So we say they don't contribute, and then we create barriers, and that becomes part of the culture. How many times have you gone out and about in the world and seen Braille signage? This tells us culturally we're not making space for these people. And then these barriers become institutionalized and they become part of the culture. So then we have a whole system where people feel like they have to overcommit to work and spend most of their waking hours in a job. And then they don't have space for self-care, care work at home, care for their, things like doing the dishes. They just don't have time for it. And so they are overgiving there to the place of depletion. And how long can we keep this up? So certain things are being rewarded and certain things aren't. The way we're talking about certain people is very different than other people. So this is how this starts to impact the whole system. And I urge you, as you're listening to some of the barriers that I talked about in episode 3 and some more in episode 4, is how does this impact at these 4 levels, at the 4 levels of this lasagna? All right. So hope that little nugget of the framing helps you through the rest of this episode. All right, now let's talk a little bit about the modern workplace. So we'll have things like the marriage penalty and the marriage bonus. So in heterosexual families, the man will generally get a marriage bonus and a child bonus for being married, meaning they can expect a bump in pay and probably a little bit more lenience. Whereas women in the same position, once they're married, and they can expect a penalty when they have children. And even the threat of potentially having children might indicate they have lower pay. So these are all different things that are current and the same, like right now. If we're talking about other people in the LGBTQ banner, then for many years, and still there is stigma around being queer or trans or intersex. So these individuals, not only do they not get the support, they might have to hide a lot of their private life, and they might not get benefits that support them, i.e., if they need to have gender affirming care, their benefits package might not cover that. It might not cover their partner, the medical benefits, for instance. For disabled people, once people get married, especially in a US context, their benefits can be removed once they get married. So I've read stories about individuals that once they've gotten married and one gets a diagnosis of a chronic illness or a terminal illness, that the couple will divorce and have to live separately in order to keep the benefits. Otherwise, they would be bankrupt under the medical bills and they would be expected to pay for it all. So we don't have true equality in terms of marriage or becoming a couple or access to that in the same way. Especially for queer couples, their benefits or life insurance or so on might not actually support their partner. They might not be considered family. And so then they can't see a partner who is in a hospital setting, for instance. So this is even before they get to work, things are stacked against them. And if their benefits aren't set up properly, or if your culture at your organization isn't supportive, they might have to lie or hide parts of themselves to even come through the door. I've heard a number of organizations say, oh, we don't have any disabled or neurodivergent or mentally ill staff. And this was, in this particular instance, a company with over 50 employees. And the math doesn't add up in that case because 1 in 4 people have disabilities. 1 in 4 people have mental health struggles. And these are UK statistics, but we can estimate according to global statistics that the WHO, the World Health Organization, says that around 16% of people have disabilities. And I believe these are underreported. So when a workplace says we don't have anyone with access needs, I find that hard to believe. And they might, in fact, have a diagnosis, or if they can't get a diagnosis, they might have access needs nonetheless. But because of fear of stigma or not getting supported, they can't actually ask for help. And they're worried about potentially that being flagged and them losing their job. So these are all before, like I said, we're just getting into the doorway of our work, and we're seeing so many pieces. A couple of things that I didn't have a chance to talk about in depth is there might be additional expenses. Last year, Scope put out data that showed disabled people needed to spend an additional £1,000 a month on top of their regular expenses for their own care needs or accessibility requirements or tools and so on. Keep in mind that there's also a disabled pay gap. And if the disabled person also is a woman and racialized, then that's going to count against them 3 times. So not only do they have this additional cost, they also have less pay. They might have additional care responsibilities for elderly parents or children. They might have additional expenses, and this goes for anybody. And they might need additional care and need support for themselves, most of which their wage won't cover and social safety nets don't cover either. So you're either living without this or they are chronically in debt. We didn't also have a chance to go too in depth to childcare costs. Oftentimes, this can be the equivalent of a person's wage, and that almost their entire pay packet would go to cover childcare costs, especially in the early years. So that is a significant cost that is often not covered. Things like family leave are really important and medical leave are important. However, there is few in some places like the US. There is not a lot of that. That is one of the only countries in the so-called modern world that do not offer maternal care time off around the time of having a child. There are some laws starting to come in that might fix this, but we don't have equity around that in many countries. Additionally, we still have laws in certain countries, including the UK, that allow certain types of people with disability to be paid as little as £1 an hour. So instead of being paid a living wage or a minimum wage, they can be paid this way. And it's legal because they have carers and they maybe have disability support. It seems like part of the continuing austerity in many countries is chipping away at the social safety net that might be supporting disabled people, might be supporting single parents and other marginalized groups that protects them. So we need to consider all of these other factors. As I said, this was not an exhaustive list, but I hope you see some glimpses of the realities of the situation and why the workplaces in general, by and large, ignore most of these needs in favor of bringing in only certain types of people who have relatively few access needs, or people are expected to hide or cover these other additional barriers somehow themselves. If you're in one of the lucky workplaces that do cover these and do have great laws in your country, or do have a really supportive company or boss, that's wonderful. But the majority of our workplaces still have a long ways to go. So people can just turn up at work, do their job, and feel supported and safe in doing their work, knowing that the wage covers their needs and that they will be supported at their workplace. So imagine someone applying for a job and they were kicked out of their childhood home because they were LGBTQ. And then they had to kind of navigate coming into the workplace. They might or might not have all the documentation they need. They might not have gone to university or gotten any credentials or studying. They might not have access to digital or other technology to help them apply for a job. And then once they get in, they have to keep their identity secret. And they don't know for sure if the benefits that they're getting will support them. Now, let's think a little bit more about once they get into work. So, how accessible is your workplace? A lot of workplaces still mistakenly think that the only accessibility things to think about are ramps and closed captioning. And as we talked about in the previous episode, this means so much more. There are so many other ways to make something accessible. We don't need to know someone's identity and all their protected characteristics and marginalized identities. We don't need to know that to do something better. We don't need to have their diagnosis in hand to offer accommodations that improve the workplace for everybody. This is where we actually have to think about things in a deeper way. And I'm going to tell you about that a little bit more in the next episode. But let's think about they've now been through the hiring process. They have been hired. They are ready to work. Then what happens? They might have mental health challenges. As I said, a quarter of people probably have that. And I wouldn't be surprised if that number was higher. And then instead of actually facing a supportive environment where they might be having an off day, or they might be struggling with depression or OCD or whatever, then instead of getting the support they need outside of work, because they might or might not be able to access support outside, and then when they bring these things up to people in their workplace, I have seen this, I've heard this as well. The idea is, yes, we understand, and can you still get the job done, right? So there might be some empathy, and as time wanes on, that empathy might lag, and the overall situation hasn't changed. The idea is now you still have to get the thing done. So how many accommodations are you willing to make sure these people can be included in our workplace? Because a lot of times, I'll just say, speaking from my own experience as someone who has mental health struggles, very few conventional workplaces actually took my needs into consideration. It was, this is the job we hired you for. This is the thing, we need to get it done. And then what do we see? We see things like Mental Health Awareness Week. And at those kinds of talks, people say, reach out for help. And they will, say we should be kind and care for each other. And yet the culture of that kindness and caring for each other and actually shifting our workplace to accommodate individuals with these situations are few and far between. We might see microaggressions. A number of people were pleased with the ability to work from home and remote work through the pandemic. Some people really struggled with their mental health, and they needed certain types of accommodations, and they needed the structure of the working environment. They needed to be away from domestic violence. They needed ability to go into work, to get away from certain situations, or they needed that for the stability of being able to go to work. Other people thrived working from home. A number of people did. And this is particularly true of racialized individuals, that the number of microaggressions they would face went down dramatically, where they weren't impacted by that day to day in the office culture. And then, because of going back to the capitalistic piece, that commercial rents cost something. And for having all those buildings basically left empty or not being used to the same degree, we were being forced, and I say we as the whole workplace, being forced back into the workplace in big numbers. So those microaggressions where people may have had a break, they didn't get that break anymore. They might be more monitored in the workplace. In fact, a number of technologies have come out where if you're not hitting certain targets constantly, if you're not jiggling your mouse every so often, then software that's going to be checking on you is going to be docking you points or something like that. So that's true. When we think of the pandemic, which we're still very much in a pandemic, I want to say that I still personally mask and will continue to do so. But we lost millions of people around the world, and there was no place to mourn this. People weren't able to travel necessarily to say goodbye to loved ones. There was very few kind of communal rituals around the people that were lost and that we might not ever see again. And with the general workplace culture that many people feel, they can't bring that grief or loss. So whether they lost someone to COVID or something else, and there's plenty of evidence to show people who lose a pet being just as impactful as losing a relative, a human relative, we might have a lot of grief and sadness that most workplace cultures aren't set up to accommodate that. Given the recent elections and other kind of more trying news that we might be seeing every day with I'll just say it, the rise of fascism, we are forced in many workplaces or professional settings to make friends or be nice to people who voted against our humanity. It's not just, oh, my team won and your team didn't win and some sportsmanship kind of situation. It's people voted to deny my humanity. That's not the same thing. And that is also a toxic workplace setup that I'm seeing quite a lot. People having a real strong, clued in perspective to the ongoing genocides of the moment, and some people being okay with that, and some people obviously being against that. Those are not, I prefer tea and you prefer coffee and we're all set. These are differences of dehumanizing people. And so we can't really be arguing about that. But oftentimes in workplaces, we come to work and then we have this situation. Then we have pay gaps. This is still a thing, no matter we can't avoid it. We recently passed the Disability Pay Gap Day in the UK. So that means disabled people work basically for 47 days without pay in this country. That's not, so let me explain that. It doesn't mean they don't get any pay for 47 days, but when we look at a person without disability compared to a disabled person and their pay packet, that people with disabilities, by and large, make significantly less through a disabled pay gap. So then they're working for 47 days without pay. That's what that translates to. And you can do that with gender. You can do that with neurodiversity. You can do that with LGBTQ identity and so on. So we don't have an equal living wage. We don't have a equitable pay system by and large. So I have a few things to say about that. There is a gender pay gap, a racialized pay gap, a disabled pay gap, and so on. There's plenty of evidence to show this. And it obviously tends to skew towards white, able-bodied men, cisgendered men. So that's a thing. That's still happening by and large. Then we're also not seeing a living wage, meaning we might have a minimum wage that is instituted federally or nationally that everyone will be paid an amount. But if we all earned that money, we couldn't necessarily afford a place to live in the city that we work. And so then people will have very long commutes because they have to live somewhere less expensive and they can't live where they work. And so their commute costs and times go up and so on. So this makes it really difficult. And because of that wealth inequity, certain types of people might not be able to afford a house or be able to rent a decent, safe place to live. And all the other trappings of success, some people might not be able to have access to food. And especially with the quote unquote cost of living crisis, it is a cost of greed crisis that some people are lining their pockets through the pandemic, through so-called inflation, that instead of doing the work and reducing prices in grocery stores or bills, rents, instead, certain people, especially the tops of companies as CEOs and other types of decision makers, bringing in lots of money, and they are underpaying, not maintaining their systems of like their water. They're literally throwing sewage in the ocean here instead of actually trying to clean up the water. So this is all part of that situation, that certain people are not paid enough to live. And then people are making hard choices of whether they eat, whether they turn on the heat at all, whether they can afford to survive. And that's even in full-time work, people are homeless. People can't eat. So the fundamentals of society that are allowing us to do this stem very much from capitalism and colonialism. Who is allowed to live like this and who is not? Who is expected to do this? And the data is all here. What are we going to do differently to create equity? And just as a reminder, equity goes a step further than equality. Equality is fairness. Equity is redistributing the resources that certain people might need more support. So historically marginalized people, i.e. disabled people, racialized people, and so on, might need more support. And I do want to say something because I am Asian, and I think it's really important that some people will look at the gender and the racialized pay gap and say, oh, you're Asian, you should be doing okay. And what I really dislike about a lot of the statistics around Asian people is some groups are probably doing quite well, but they're not disaggregating the data. So they put all Asian people together. Not only do they treat Asians as the model minority that we are, obviously smart enough or obviously doing the right things, making the right choices and upholding white supremacy and doing okay, but we're paid really well. And that might be true of certain Chinese or Indian diaspora in certain categories, like certain sectors. That might be very true. But when we look at the disaggregated data, meaning we look at per region or by country of origin, the statistics are dire. Queer Asian people might be living on the margins. The last data I saw that was any good was from a few years ago from the US saying they were making less than 10,000 US dollars a year. That's not enough to survive. They're literally living on the fringes. Asian disabled people, not in the same category, people from Southeast Asia or from certain types of colonization and undergoing certain types of histories don't have the same access and don't have the same wage. The number of people who might be undocumented also goes up depending when we start to disaggregate. We can see this. So this is what I'm trying to say, that we can't just look at the top end superficial thing. We have to look at how do we want to treat people in our workplace. And I think that right now I've raised a lot of tension. So as I said, this is not an exhaustive wandering that we've taken over the last 30, 40 minutes together, but it starts to paint a picture of how dire it is and what the workplace really might look like for people who don't have the same barriers and how those barriers are impacting people's ability to do work or find work even. And a lot of times people will say, okay, I want you to solve this for me and I want to feel better about it. And I'm not going to do you that favor today. I'm going to leave this tension with you. You're going to feel this tension. And part of why we need to do this is we need to sit with the tension without running to a solution straight away. And I talk a lot about this in my course, Sowing Post-Capitalist Seeds. That tension can tell us a lot. The tension in our body, for instance, meaning there's a tension between our bones and our muscles. That's what gives us the three-dimensionality, the ability to stand or move. Our muscles comes because there is tension between the muscles against the bones. That can help us, that can give us a framework. So here, the tension here is not necessarily bad, it's uncomfortable. Acknowledge that discomfort, acknowledge this. Maybe do a little digging. And we're going to come back and see this with some fresh eyes in the next episode, where we're going to start painting a picture and seeing some glimpses of possibility, of hope, of change, of what we can actually do to address this at a very systemic level. So, with that being said, it has been such a delight to have you on today's episode, and I will see you back here for the next episode. Thank you for joining me on today's episode. Let's connect and continue the discussion on our website.